All right, so thanks for joining. It'll be a shorter meeting today, but just wanted to give a quick status update on the prescriptive buyer journeys and then address any questions, comments, concerns, and things that are coming up for content from different teams. But you can look at the mural. That is the latest on the enterprise buyer journey with the help of content and product and technical marketing. Last week, we had a good discussion just around the actual content to go into those. It's kind of like the framework. And from that conversation, I think a really good outcome was discussing a potential OKR for Q4. I don't know if John or Bree want to speak to that from last week.
Our team is working on updating so that we have everything in order appropriately, just kind of moving around the content that we think is in there now and making sure that it aligns with the story that we're trying to tell. Mm-hmm. But I think that meeting was really helpful because I think that we all just were putting our best content forward without a strategy, and now there's a strategy in place, which is kind of where we're at. We'll have it this week.
And I'll grab the Google Doc also.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have a better MVC of that. I mean, the first pass of it was, 54 pieces of content in 36 business hours. I don't know. It was pretty fast turnaround.
I also think that based on some of the use cases,
we've got a little more.
I was gonna say, based on like some of it is also just a little bit reflected from the existing use case integrated campaigns, because we did have breakouts by awareness, consideration, purchase. I think having a discussion altogether on the cohesiveness between the stages was helpful to get on the same page. But I think the discussion around the storyboarding was really interesting about potentially rolling those out.
I mean, the storyboarding conversation really gets into let's get serious and double click into what we for the given persona, for the given use case, what are we anticipating that we think they need at that point? I mean, we're doing it right now, but we're doing it really superficially, and we're doing it individually. So it's happening in silos. It's happening in individuals' heads. What I think Erica and I are both suggesting that we do for the CI campaign is let's double click on one of these and acknowledge that right now Agnes and you both have to create 54 different emails with offers. I mean, you have a non-trivial exercise ahead of you. And so you guys can get started on that and go, but this I think is an opportunity for us to revisit one of these and see how can we further refine it.
Sorry, my internet was cutting out a little bit. I think I caught the last bit of that. But yeah, hopefully that does move forward for an OKR. Just especially being specific to the persona, identifying the messaging per stage, and then defining what that content looks like if we don't already have it existing. And I'm also going to drop in the Google Doc, the working Google Doc of the content that as aligns to the stages, and that's by practitioner and manager. I also wanted to point out, and I'll go ahead and just screen share for the recording, that it is in the second bullet, that we have this outlined, and it basically flows in relation to the prescriptive buyer journey, the practitioner and manager, and then the assets 1, 2, and 3 aligned to each stage. What we've also been diving into with Parker is for competitive, where those will fit for the CI related competitors that we're planning to run campaigns against in Q4 with timing TBD, but identifying that we would introduce competitors into the consideration stage of the buyer journey. So just wanted to point that out. And then in discussions with partner marketing, the alliance partners would have their own prescriptive buyer journeys that I think initially we were discussing having those be in routes to the into the overall journey. So we need to have kind of that prescription across all of the and I don't know if we have the content yet, but we need to identify what content we need for each partner and then build to that. But just to identify that we had some of those included. Overall, I know that some of you have already been heavily in the conversations around the prescriptive buyer journeys, persona-based buyer journeys, but for those who haven't been, are there any questions? Is this something that you could see being useful in defining your campaign tactics, or that perhaps, like Colin, you maybe know some of the things that are coming up for analyst relations content that will fit in here, or that you can see where maybe things that we could purchase in the future would fit into this?
Yeah, I think that that's how we could use it, is just to help understand what kind of the degree or the depth of which you're kind of looking at these different, the volume and the different kind of themes as we're kind of looking at that. So we can make a joint decision on like, what do we pay for?
Mm-hmm.
And where it might it fit, and have some suggestions around, you know, swapping things out, et cetera. Yeah.
Hey, Jackie, what is row 22, where like 22B, introduction to GitLab flow, 22C, like, I don't know what column they're lining up to.
I don't know who placed those there. I'm wondering if John or Bree or Erica, I guess I don't know if Erica's actually on the call, but John or Bree or Dan, are you familiar with what that row is? Was Erica adding more as like as a question comment for placing somewhere else in the funnel?
I don't know why. No, I can't tell you.
Oh, you know what? I think all of these are landing pages, potentially, which the intent was to have actual like content, gated content in terms of things that you would actually put behind a gate, not a web page. And so it might have just been holding those to the side and replacing with gated type content.
Help me understand again why we want gated content.
Because this will fit into the nurtures as well as the digital plans, like across the channels when we're offering these things to a user. As we can build that scale of saying, we know this bucket of people is in the CI consideration stage, for example, the assets that we identify here, we can play against in our retargeting, our like prospecting and account-based digital tactics, as well as in our nurture.
And
so
we can't do that if it's not gated.
It's just that the in route of having something that is gated, it is more of like I don't want to say the word like meaty, like it's something that somebody would be more likely to click and want to engage with. That's just general best practice for the nurtures.
Wondering how that aligns though with the segmented marketing plans push to be doing less gated content. This seems like a lot more than we're doing.
Let me also address that. There are some specific technical challenges, like the idea of pushing people to Path Factory and having it not be like nothing be behind a form is a little bit contingent on having the tracking be able to pass through the channels that somebody engaged with to the touch points. So for example, right now we can send them to a landing page. When they fill out the form, the visible JavaScript fires, all of the rich UTM content or UTM parameters are tracked specifically. And then that can then be aggregated into our reporting so we can see channels and tactics, what's working, what's not, what levers do we want to pull. When you push them into Path Factory, when someone fills out a form, the JavaScript is sometimes firing, but it's not consistent. And that's what Robert and Sarah are diving into with Path Factory and Visible. Because if we're losing that UTM data, then we kind of are losing half the story of the ROI of the spend. So
this is the progressive tracking.
Progressive is more just like how you set up your forms. So progressive is a piece of it, but it's more about, we can send people to ungated journeys in Path Factory, but we would be looking at considerable decreases in inquiries, I would say. if we're giving the
Okay.
content away. I still agree with the
Okay.
direction of ungating, but I would say that there are some technical pieces we need to work out. And we're still moving that
Okay,
direction.
so
I just think
okay,
the
let's continue.
transition will be longer than an immediate, let's flip everything. But
Okay.
we can keep on discussing that.
So this is in lieu of being able to go after that goal at this point because of the technology barriers.
Yes, and let me also clarify one thing. When we push from nurture, we do not push them to a form. We do not push them to a landing page. Because we know who they are, we put a parameter into the link so that they go straight into Path Factory, and because they're not anonymous, they are known. They don't get served that, and they can binge on the content and not have to fill out a form. But if they're anonymous, like let's say they're coming from an ad and we're spending money on them pushing from that ad to, let's say we were to push them straight into Path Factory. When they fill out that form and all the UTMs are stripped from that conversion, when we try to look at the reporting, we're saying, oh, we're putting tons of money into this, but the UTMs don't track, so we can't tie that conversion back to the ads. And it kind of makes it so we don't have great visibility into how that budget is being returned. So then it gives more reason to push to a landing page because we can be confident that we can tie back those conversions to the money being spent. Just to give some background. It's been a very long conversation about.
But the distinction though is there's two different scenarios. One scenario is if you're doing, if we're doing ads, and search engine marketing, and we're directing people to an asset, of course we want them to hit a landing page where they have to register for it. How else are we going to know who they are? Mm-hmm. That's not this list, is it?
This list can play into the digital advertising. If you're thinking organic, like what is placed on the website, that's a different conversation.
No,
we can use.
I'm making the distinction, I guess, between email marketing, where we're sending people an email, a follow up. We're in the process of doing a nurture.
Yes.
I mean, they're different, right? If I'm doing a nurture, I know who they are. I'm not going to send them to a form because I don't need to get more information from them. I'm going to send them to the asset. I want them to click and read it.
Correct.
I mean, straight through. And so in the case of an email nurture, gated or ungated is irrelevant, right?
Let me challenge how you're going about this, because the prescriptive buyer journey is to identify this persona at this stage would best relate to this content, and this content would help them progress to the next stage. So whether it's email nurture, digital, maybe a nurture, we're pushing them straight into Path Factory. Maybe from paid digital, we're pushing them straight into landing pages until we get the tracking figured out. From the website, you could choose to put them into a Path Factory promoter track. Like the vehicle of getting them to the content is less the focus as what is the right content for this stage, for this persona, for this use case.
Which is regardless of whether the content's gated or ungated.
Correct. So,
right.
But for example, like you could separately run an exercise to say what web pages that are ungated are relevant for each stage of the buyer journey. That might be a relevant exercise, but for the purpose of this, we needed a framework and a starting point to build the right content at the right time for our nurture, for our advertising, and for some of the tactics that we'll be running to make sure everything's cohesive. Does that somewhat differentiate what you were trying to mention? Like whether it's gated or ungated, I probably wouldn't push an ad to a web page because the possibility of the conversion, it's relevant on, or it's relying on different, there's just more factors.
But I might send an email to someone that sends them to a web page that has relevant comparison or relevant information. You
could, and I think that we should investigate that. But I also think you could push them to, for example, the Breakthrough DevOps, Successful DevOps Adoption Strategies webcast. And in the Path Factory track, you can have related assets that aren't all gated. Like that's where you can put more pages for them to dive into.
I'm just challenging the entry point or the assumption that everything here has to be gated.
I think that for the purposes of what we needed this prescriptive buyer journey to accomplish, which is to tell us what the content is that will move them forward. That was the goal here. And that's why it was expedited, because we don't want to create a bunch of plans and tactics that aren't aligned to what you would identify as the ideal prescriptive buyer journey.
Right.
But if we want to sprinkle in things that are not gated, like I think that those would be super relevant to be in all of the
Yeah, I think the goal ultimately is, what's the right buyer's journey? What's the right content that's going to help people to move along and to learn and to move through their buyer's journey? And I think the characteristic of whether it's gated or ungated is important to know, but I wouldn't use that. My concern was that, you know, early on in this conversation, it was almost a filter that said, don't put it on the spreadsheet unless it's gated. And I think that's putting a priority on gated or ungated versus what's the right flow.
And that was the intent. It still is. Like we can fit landing pages in, but I didn't want to have this built out to just show ungated. Maybe another version of this that has all web pages would be useful. I don't know if we want to build in to the framework like an overlay of ungated.
I think the goal is to get the right flow. And then if we want to go back and look at gated or ungated and change that, then we can, I think. So
I do think it would be helpful to see, also we have like the topic and solution pages are built into the Mural framework. And so those are entry points, or where we are categorizing them based on the buyer journey stage. So awareness, consideration, or decision purchase. And so that's also part of why it's already included in the framework. So if you're pointing from topic page to a topic page, that doesn't really relate. It makes sense. But keep challenging me. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Like, this should be a team effort on if we need to fit that into the framework in some way. So
yeah, I guess, Jackie, my only deal is I want to make sure that as we go into this, as we try to detail out what are the pieces of content that we think a manager needs to hear while they're in the awareness phase versus, you know, later on in the life cycle when they're either in decision, you know, consideration or decision. I just think our palette of choices should be, okay, here's all of our choices. And in some cases, you're gonna, especially if you're doing paid search and you're doing paid ads, then you're absolutely going to want to make sure they hit on pages that are going to lead to a conversion and where you're going to get their information. Totally get that. Mm-hmm. Other cases where they've already converted and now we're in the process of nurturing them and we're serving them pieces of content. Now you've got a much broader palette of things you can do with them because you know who they are and you know whether or not they're clicking on it, you know, because it's all an email. So that's the distinction I was making. And as I think about it from the buyer's perspective, not from the whether or not I get MQL points on the back end of it, I think about it from the buyer's perspective of what's the things that they need to know. Do they need to see an ROI study? Do they need to see a comparison page? Right? That's where I think a lot of this stuff we have a whole broad spectrum of things that may not be gated.
And I think that's fair.
It sounds like you're suggesting there's two paths for each.
No,
or two journeys for each of these. There's the unnurturing journey. Okay. Good.
Well, I mean, the way this asked, but the way the ask was originally teed up, it was unclear as to which this was.
Okay. So
right.
So we're evolving our thinking on this. That's right. I think there's a lot of stuff here, and I don't know. Do you have a sense like what the first iteration of this is, or MVC of this is? It's not all of it. I freaked out a little when I saw Alliance Partners. I was like, oh boy.
Yeah, that's a
lot of good stuff. I'm assuming that's a later phase, but
yeah, that's a lot that's going to be needed for that. I actually, John, when you're mentioning that you want to think of it more from the buyer perspective and what is actually useful, is it going to be
user, reader, consumer? I mean,
yes.
I want to make sure when you say buyer, I'm not talking about the manager. I'm talking about both.
No, when I say buyer, I mean practitioner, manager, or executive,
reader.
like just
right.
general. we do want to think about it, and having that lens of gated or ungated, that's more critical in the awareness stage, because that's where they are heating up to MQL. So if we're pushing them to pages where we're not tracking or we're not seeing their engagement reflected in the scoring, that is a concern. But in terms of actually building out the prescriptive buyer journey by persona, and as we talk about these storyboards, I think what you're mentioning is really going to be key. And even if we just get everything in one spot and having it by stage, whether it's gated or ungated, would still be useful to have documented, which I think is mostly captured in the mural, where it says topic and solution, but there are probably other pages, categories that aren't reflected there. And the question would be, are they useful? How do we use them? What stages do they align to? And in the effort, right, your team is moving a bunch of the handbook pages to be publicly available, I think across all of strategic marketing, right? So that's kind of a separate conversation, but how does that fit into the journey as well? We need to discuss that.
Was that to Mahesh?
I know Mahesh is nodding because we have talked about that. That is there. I thought that there were other teams also considering moving it to be less hidden.
All our content is now public. There's nothing that's gated. The only thing that we could potentially gate would be the PDF downloads, from our comparison page. Mm-hmm. Right now it's open because of the logistics and, timelines and everything else. But eventually, the content is available for them to consume in a public web page. But if they wanted it in a certain format, they probably have to give their name, and that's we've tried that on the Bitbucket page. It's worked pretty well. There's a good amount of registrants through that process, but that's a decision for us to make based on the big picture guidance on we want to make most of the content ungated. And this one, maybe we can get away with it because that same content is available in an ungated format. Mm-hmm. So it's not like you have to go through a gated process to consume it. It's just if you want it in a particular way or format, then you kind of sign up and give your name and number, and you get the PDF, right, version of the same thing that's available on the website. So I think that way you can check both boxes. That was sort of part of the thought process there. So
it would be an entry point into the consideration stage, and having those aligned as we can build out the competitive nurtures.
And generally, I'm on the same page as I think John and Dan are also, and Colin had made a point around thinking more broadly around the resources. I certainly see the perspective you're coming from, because you've got a certain sort of a sequence of steps you want the user to take, and you have investments on ads and everything else, and the only way that's justified is if it's conversions and just not pure impressions. So maybe we can look at the content more broadly, but highlight the ones that are more suited for gating, as with an asterisk or something like that. So you have a full view of the buyer's journey or the content available to take them through that journey, awareness, consideration, and purchase. But we can just highlight the ones that are more suited for, putting behind the gate, so that you can just purely, and coming from an ad or some other, investment, in other platforms, you can bring them into that landing page, but the rest of them, they just kind of, float around and just consume the content. But at least we'll know where to direct them, and we can get the right, as you said, additional content, right? What is that additional content? These list of web pages. Well, at least if you have a full holistic picture, what links to add to that page, that particular landing page. If you wanted to add that.
And that also reminds me of what Erica had mentioned in the last one of these calls, when she said we should consider a Path Factory audit, because that is a good representation of everything we have: web pages, YouTube videos, just across the board. And right now the awareness, consideration, and purchase is built off of what type of content it is. But if we can actually do that audit and all be on the same page and use that as the source of truth of where something belongs, then I think that accomplishes what you all are mentioning, and we can use that in turn for our planning. Mm-hmm. John, you're making a weird face. I mean, not weird. You're scrunching your face up like you didn't agree. So What?
No, it's just somewhere we made an assumption that the type of content equals the stage in the buyer's journey, and
That was that was
that-
simply Path Factory. That was
that-
only
and-
for launching Path Factory, and that was
Yeah.
a year ago. So we
yeah,
need
and
to
the-
revisit that.
And the face I'm making was trying kind of the face of what happens when I don't know, biting into a lemon. It was like, oh, really? Because I don't know if we've exercised that kind of discipline around types of content equal stages, which is like, I think we'd get random results. So it's one that I think we need to do the audit of Path Factory. B, I think the double click into Path Factory, we've got a content inventory that's gotten much more mature as we've worked it. We've done pretty cool stuff on that. But I think if I look forward for the content inventory that we've done, I think we need to look at how we evolve it into being content that lives in Path Factory, which means Path Factory's scope has to expand to being stuff that's outside of that. There are things in Path Factory that may not be in a path, but there's stuff that just all lives in Path Factory. But that's a totally separate conversation.
Yeah.
Totally separate.
Just for what it's worth, from the gated ungated thing, yeah, we're on board with the ungating as much as possible, but there's obviously some things that make more sense, high value or interactive, like the TEI estimator, where it's personal. There's a personalization function to it where it makes sense to do that. And yeah, big fan about using this journey thing and just getting that reconciled with Path Factory. Like let's tell stories with Path Factory as opposed to here's some stuff. Big fan of that.
Gotta love the journey thing. Yeah, I think as we jump into Q4, there'll be more and more focus on Path Factory and these journeys and doing that audit. So thank you all for your time. Everyone has
thank
hard
you. This is
stops.
good.
So I'll record or post the recording. Thanks
Thank you.
again. Bye.
Thank you.